One of the most misunderstood words in our English vocabulary is the word meek. I mean, if I called any person meek, it would probably be perceived as an insult, right? When we hear the word meek, we might think of Edward Norton's character in the movie Fight Club, or Peter Parker before he becomes Spider-Man, or pretty much all of the hobbits from the Lord of the Rings. We might think of these spineless jellyfish type of people that just don't have the fortitude to stick up for themselves. Have you ever heard the expression, meek as a mouse? I mean, last I checked, no one ever mistook a mouse for the king of the jungle. The truth is that most people hear the word meek, that they think of someone sheepish and maybe perhaps cowardly. But when Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek," do you think that this is what he meant?
Just gonna let that guy cut? There's obviously a line.
Makes you kind of angry, doesn't it?
If you're not gonna say something, I will.
Makes you want to yell and scream, right?
Yeah.
I used to be just like you, until I tried the Meekwalizer.
What?
The Meekwalizer. Just one puff is all I need to get myself through those difficult situations.
How does it work?
Jesus said it best when he said, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." But being meek isn't always easy. That's where the Meekwalizer comes in. Try it.
Yeah, no thanks.
Come on, try it. First one's free.
Excuse me. I don't mean to be a bother, but I have an appointment to get to and was wondering if I could cut ahead of you in line.
I also have appointments.
Haven't you ever heard of ladies first? Where are your manners?
You wanna talk about manners? I'll show you some manners, lady.
It's okay. You can walk all over me. Go ahead in line.
Looks like it worked.
Sure did. Now I'm so close to the earth, I can practically inherit it.
Thanks, Meekwalizer.
No, thank you, Meekwalizer.
Call your doctor and ask for a Meekwalizer by name. Meekwalizer cannot be used by anyone who is pregnant or planning on becoming pregnant or is near anyone who is either pregnant or planning on becoming pregnant. Meekwalizer can cause side effects, which include intestinal discoloration, arbitrary barking, and occasional hypnosis. Meekwalizer is illegal in 7 western states, including New Mexico. Do not place Meekwalizer near air conditioning vents. Do not use Meekwalizer in hot tubs or saunas. Do not tempt Meekwalizer with sweets. Void where prohibited by law or biblical interpretation.
We're in week 3 of our series, Beautiful, where we're looking at a series of statements that Jesus made at the beginning of his most famous talk, the Sermon on the Mount. We call these statements the Beatitudes, and they would have been somewhat shocking to the people who sat on the hillside to hear Jesus teach that day. I mean, understand, these people who were listening that day, they were not the spiritual rock stars of their day. They weren't the celebrated, the admired, the adored. They were the ordinary, the everyday, the unheralded. But along comes Jesus, and he pays attention to these people. Moving from town to town, he teaches about a kingdom where people would experience God personally and enjoy all the benefits of God's favor. And it wasn't just a future pie-in-the-sky kind of kingdom. It was a kingdom for the right now. Life in this kingdom was beautiful. It was blessed. And so naturally, the people wanted to know, who is this kingdom for? Who gets to enjoy this beautiful and blessed life? Now, as Jesus looks out on this crowd of thousands, he knows many of them are battered and bruised. They're the ones who've suffered injustice at the hands of power-hungry men in a ruthless conquering empire. They've struggled under the heavy weight of legalism and this religious system that has just tied a heavy load on their backs. That they seem to be the bottom of society's barrel. Yet here they are, anxious to see Jesus, longing to be a part of this kingdom that he talks about. And Jesus looks out at them and says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." Jesus sees meekness in the faces before him, and he declares it as something of value, something beautiful, something blessed. Meek clearly does not mean what we sometimes think it means. I want to show you something. At first, it will seem kind of unrelated to what we're talking about, but I want to take you in because I think it will serve as a metaphor to create this new understanding of this important word, meek. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the meek," he wasn't talking about weakness. Meekness isn't weakness. Meekness is actually strength. Real meekness is power under control. Say that after me. Power under control. The power of a horse becomes useful when the horse has been tamed, harnessed, and directed. Theologian Scott McKnight, he defines Jesus' word meek in this way. He says, the meek are those who suffer and have been humbled. And yet they do not seek revenge, but God's glory and the welfare of others. In other words, they lovingly trust God and hope in God's timing and God's justice. When God looks out and sees meekness in the faces before him, does he see weakness? No way. He sees power under control. He sees power that has been submitted to God's control and to God's purposes, and he declares it a beautiful thing. To really get the blessedness of meekness, we need to realize that the power isn't really having a powerful job or title or position. It's not about being a natural-born type A type of person. You see, we all have power. Every person has power. Sometimes the most powerful person in a room is a 2-year-old. You see a 2-year-old throwing themselves this tantrum in the middle of a grocery store aisle, you know that a 2-year-old has power. The meek, they're not powerless people. They may be people who've suffered at the hands of power, true, but they're not powerless people. They're people who allow their power to be tamed, to be harnessed, to be directed by God. Like the poor in spirit, like those who mourn, they're humble. They don't scratch and claw and climb over others to build their personal kingdoms. They don't plot revenge against those who've wronged them. They direct their energy toward God, trusting God, relying on His timing, His justice, seeking His glory and not their own. The meek demonstrate power under control. And Jesus said that they are blessed. They'll experience a quality of life, a beautiful life. They will inherit the earth. The kingdom is theirs. There's a person in the Bible who most of us have probably heard of, Maybe you could argue he's the second most famous person in the entire Bible next to Jesus. I'm talking about a guy by the name of Moses. And Moses is arguably one of the greatest leaders in all of human history. I mean, it was Moses who took on Pharaoh, the ruler of the most powerful empire, the Egyptian empire. And he said, let God's people go. I mean, it was Moses who parted the Red Sea. It was Moses who delivered the 10 Commandments to God's people. It was Moses who led Israel through the wilderness to the Promised Land. A lot of us have probably heard a lot about Moses, the powerful leader. But there's something about Moses that maybe we haven't heard. There's a verse in the book of Numbers describing this great man. It says this. It says, now Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. It's quite a statement. But look how another translation puts it. The American Standard Version puts the text this way. It says, now the man Moses was very meek, above all which were upon the face of the earth. Moses, the great leader, the man's man, the meekest person on the face of the earth? Meekness obviously doesn't equal weakness. Who would call Moses weak? Moses wasn't weak. But he was like that horse. His power had come under control. There was a time when Moses had a power that was out of control. At one time in his life, he really was the prince of Egypt. He lived in the royal palace of Pharaoh. He had the best education, major wealth, incredible prestige. Everywhere he went, people had to bow down to him when he passed by. I mean, it kind of sounds like somebody who had it all, right? But Moses lacked meekness, and it cost him dearly. One time in this fit of rage, Moses loses it and he actually kills another guy. I mean, even a prince can't go around committing murder, and so he becomes a fugitive. He has to flee Egypt, and he ends up in the wilderness working as a shepherd. I mean, talk about a crash landing. Prince to shepherd. But that's what happened to Moses, because he hadn't learned power under control. He hadn't learned meekness. You see, power is a tricky thing. The truth is, a lot of us try to use whatever power we have to satisfy our desires to get what we want. So many times we mistreat other people, or we really blow it in relationships because you know what went wrong? It was personal power out of control. We wanted something that we didn't get, or we got something that we didn't want. And we get angry, we sulk, we clam up, we argue, we fuss. We fight, we say insulting things. What we're really doing is we're using our personal power to try to get even, to enact revenge, to try to get what we want. That's what Moses did. He took matters in his own hands. He ends up killing another guy. Now, I'm pretty sure that not many of us have ever used our personal power quite in that way. But we all know what it means to push and pull, to argue and fight. But we also know that never works. I mean, in fact, trying to assert our personal power usually makes things much worse. Most of us don't end up like fugitives on the other side of the law like Moses, but we all know how using our personal power in that way brings us down. It messes up things in our lives. I find it interesting that God didn't lift Moses up as a leader of the people while he was the prince of Egypt. It was actually the opposite. It was when he was stripped of all of his powerful titles and found himself as a lowly shepherd in the desert that the work of God seemed to really begin to flow through his life. I mean, I wonder if the experience of being a fugitive gave God the opportunity to grow and cultivate meekness in his life. The man who once acted impulsively, abusing the power he possessed, became the very man who said things to God like, "If you're pleased with me, God, teach me your ways, so that I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people." He also says this to God. He says, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? Just before his greatest accomplishment of bringing God's people to the promised land, Moses demonstrates meekness. He allows the power that he has to be God's power, not his own. He allows God's power, God's agenda to replace his own. He becomes a God-directed person. And man, did God's power flow through him. Moses knew everything depended on moving forward in God's power, not his own. Now listen, I know some of us might be thinking, yeah, right. Be meek and everything will turn out for the best. Be meek and you'll have a beautiful life. Come on, man. I mean, I live in a work world that's kind of this dog-eat-dog type of world. I mean, if I'm going to make it, I have to claw and grab at everything that I have. I mean, it's important for us to understand that this teaching was very countercultural back in Jesus' day to all those that were sitting on the hillside that day. And it's just as countercultural today. I mean, our society says that the ones who get ahead are the ones who are always focused on their own agenda, their own goals, the ones who assert their own personal power that thwart the power of others. That's who we believe gets ahead in our world, the ambitious, the stop-at-nothing types. But Jesus says, no. It's not the movers and shakers who are the real winners. It's the meek. The meek will inherit the earth. You might be surprised to find out that leading-edge research of business management actually bears this out. Corporate leaders with great positional influence get this idea of meekness as well. Jim Collins, who's become a very well-known author in the business community, he authored a book called Good to Great. In it, he profiled companies that, in his own words, defy gravity and convert long-term mediocrity into long-term superiority. He said that one of the distinguishing factors that his team of researchers discovered is what he called level 5 leaders. Level 5 leaders have two distinguishing characteristics according to Collins. He said, first, they have this fierce resolve to do whatever needs to be done. It's their power. But then second is this. He said that these leaders are not I-centered. Instead, they have this extreme personal humility. That's the meekness. It's their power under control. Collins actually contrasts two business leaders. One few people have heard of, Ken Iverson, and the other that I would assume most of us have heard of, Lee Iacocca. Ken Iverson was the CEO of Nucor. He took his company from near bankruptcy to one of the most successful steel companies in the entire world. He was the one that oversaw Nucor's transformation. Collins interviewed one of his board members, and here's how his own board described Iverson. He said, Ken is a very modest and humble man. I've never known a person as successful in doing what he has done that's as modest as he is. That's true in his private life as well. The simplicity of him is amazing. I mean, little things. He has a simple house that he's lived in for ages. He only has a carport. That he complained to me one day how he had to use his credit card to scrape the frost off the windows and he broke the credit card. I told him, you know what, Ken? There's a solution for that. Enclose that carport, make it a garage. And his response, heck, it's not really that big of a deal. And that's what was always true of him. He was just this humble and simple guy. As Iverson led this company, he did away with executive perks like reserved parking spaces or special health benefits. He was known to personally answer the telephone whenever he was in the office. This was a guy who ran the successful and greatest corporations in America. Jim Collins contrasted Iverson to Lee Iacocca, who saved Chrysler from the brink of catastrophe, performing one of the most celebrated turnarounds in American business history. Then, however, he diverted his attention to making himself one of the most celebrated CEOs in American history. He appeared regularly on talk shows. He starred in over 80 commercials. He even considered running for president. His book titled Iacocca, now why would he call it that, right? It sold 7 million copies, and it elevated him to star status. And while his personal stock soared in the second half of his tenure as CEO, Chrysler's stock fell 31% behind the general market. He postponed his retirement so many times that insiders at Chrysler began to joke that IACOCA stood for I am chairman of Chrysler Corporation always. Colin's bottom line was that the research said that the best leaders, relationally and financially, are those who are meek, power under control. One of the members of our teaching team shared a story about a guy by the name of David Sims. From a worldly point of view, David was on top. He was in the electrical distribution business, and he was making money hand over fist. He was extremely well off, a really powerful guy. But David writes these words. He says, I believed I deserved everything. Women, money, prestige, anything that I wanted. A guy who knew David Sims back then said he was rich and successful, but he was pretty hated. He just pushed everybody around to get whatever he wanted. Unfortunately, David Sims became addicted to cocaine, alcohol, as well as power. And these things really led to things really falling apart for him. 2 bankruptcies, domestic violence, adultery, finally led to divorce. He says in his own words, through all of the hardships, when I was near rock bottom, I would turn to God in prayer, asking for a miracle, promising that I would serve him if he did one. But each time God got me through, I took the credit for it. I patted myself on the back, but then eventually things got worse. By the time the divorce was almost final, I was cocky, prideful, selfish person, back on top with a 6-figure income. I felt like I had the world by its tail. Then came an accident. While riding bikes with his kids on a camping trip, David flipped over the handlebars of his bike and was instantly paralyzed. David was now a quadriplegic. For 2 more years, he says, I continued to drink, relied on my girlfriend, who herself was an alcoholic. She was physically violent with me when she was drunk, and she eventually ended up in jail for it. I moved back to my hometown where I found myself alone in a very big house. I couldn't dress myself, couldn't feed myself, couldn't do anything for myself, and I was all alone. I finally gave up. I didn't care if I died. I'll never forget the night that I broke down in tears and I cried out to God. I acknowledged that I wasn't worthy to even ask for help and confessed all that I had done before. I begged the Lord to take me back as I was and make me whatever he would. I promised to go wherever he wanted, to be a quadriplegic if that's what he wanted. I mean, whatever. It didn't matter. David says, I told God, just please take over because I can't do it anymore. From that point, God turned this guy's life around. He says, I became so independent that I could even tie my own shoes without the function of my hands. Everything they said I couldn't do, I did. A week after I prayed that first prayer, I found my first church. He says, I can't tell you what a blessing that accident has actually turned out to be in my life. I'm saved. I'm happy. God has provided everything that I could have ever needed or wanted. I spend half my time volunteering at local hospitals, praying with patients, working with them in therapy. The other half of my time I spend volunteering at church, working with several ministries. I even started a ministry called More Than Conquerors to reach people who've had some sort of tragedy in their lives. David says that they had t-shirts made that say, don't let the wheelchair fool you. Jesus took care of my real handicap a long time ago. We serve an awesome God. David can't use his arms and legs, and he's happier than most of the people we know. You know why? Because Jesus made his life beautiful. He can make your life beautiful too. Don't wait to flip over the handlebars of your life to give yourself totally to him. Because when you do, your life changes. You become powerful in ways that you never dreamed possible. The meek are those who have suffered. They've been humbled. And yet they do not seek revenge, but God's glory and the welfare of others. In other words, they lovingly trust God and hope in God's timing and God's justice. For anyone who's bruised and beaten, struggling under the weight of some injustice or wrong, you don't need to be burdened with revenge. For anyone who's been scratching and clawing to try to gain power for yourself, you don't have to bear the burden of trying to prove your worth. For anyone here who's been humbled, you don't have to be stuck in the grief or the shame that's associated with that. Instead, you can turn to God. You can trust Him. You can let Him have control. Because blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Elsewhere, Jesus said these words. He says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart. You will find rest for your souls." Interestingly enough, the word gentle in that passage is the same word in our beatitude for meek. I mean, Jesus was meek. He was the very personification of power under control. No one has ever been more undeserving of suffering and humility that He endured than Jesus was. I mean, at any moment, He could have used His power to call down fire from heaven to save Himself from the cross. Yet in His meekness, He entrusted Himself to His Father. He gave Himself to save the very ones who had injured Him, to save you and me. Is meekness weakness? Not a chance. Meekness is power under God's control. Meekness is a beautiful thing. And those who possess it, they are blessed.